Okay. Can you all see my screen okay? Excellent.
Yes, we can see it.
Okay, cool. So this is just really Talent Search Grant Writing 101. This is a very basic intro, high level presentation to get people started. I know that there are a lot of directors who, um, maybe not be new to Trio, but they are new to being a director and they've not written the grant before. Some of you inherited a program. Some of you may be advisors or counselors hoping to be a director at some point, and maybe you haven't had a chance to work on these grants. And so we like to do these presentations to give everybody at least some comfort level about what the grant actually is, how to tackle it, and just give an understanding of what's really the most important parts of the application. So that's the whole point of this presentation, is just a very high level introduction to grant writing. I'm Heath Alexander. I'm the Senior Director of Grants and Program Evaluation at Study Smart Tutors. I have a long 25 plus year history in TRIO programs dating back to when I was actually a participant in Talent Search. When I was in high school, I became a summer camp counselor for Upward Bound and later became an advisor and director of Upward Bound. And I spent about 11 years working in some capacity for an Upward Bound and Upward Bound Math Science programs. And then in 2008, I moved to Washington, D.C., where I currently still live, and worked at the Council for Opportunity and Education for several years, where I was a faculty member of the proposal writing workshops and helped critique people's applications and presented. But most importantly, when the Higher Education Act of 2008 passed, it provided for a new appeal process for TRIO programs who were unsuccessful in the grant competition, but who fell within a certain range of the cutoff score. And because I was a former director and because we had some gaps in personnel at the time, I took a primary lead in helping institutions appeal. And so what that meant was for about 5 or so years, for every grant competition, institutions and organizations would send me or COE their grant application and their readers' comments so that we could read through them and find errors that readers made in scoring the applications so that we could come up with an appeal letter. So over the course of those years, I just read hundreds of grant applications and literally thousands of readers' comments from every TRIO competition. I mention all that to say that I understand these programs pretty intimately, from being a participant, being just a student worker, summer counselor, to being a director, and to also working at a high level here in DC, where I got a chance to learn how the readers score these applications, what kind of patterns did I find within how they took points off for certain sections and different grants. And just over the course of those years, really, kind of in a way got a cheat sheet for sort of how the department scores grants. Um, I transitioned all of that to start working full time on grant writing in 2014. So this is my 11th year working in mostly a full time capacity, helping institutions write federal grants, TRIO, Gear Up, Title III, Title V, even worked on charter school improvement, federal grants, and Department of Labor grants, like so all kinds of different federal grants, but TRIO programs in particular are my expertise. If you don't mind, I would also like to hear from each of you, but you can just put in the chat box if you want to. Your name is already up there, so just tell me, institution and maybe your title in Talent Search. And, also let me know if, you've written grants before, um, if you've had a chance to work on these applications. I'd love to hear, kind of what your expertise level is so I can tailor my comments to, to where you are. If you don't mind, just type in the chat box number of years in TRIO and maybe like yes or no, any experience in writing grants. Are you all able to write in the chat box?
Yes, I'm writing right.
Oh, okay. 2007, never written one as a director, but involved in the process. Okay, great. Also, if you don't currently have a talent search grant and you're writing for a new one, please go ahead and put that as well. Okay, excellent. Melvin, I already know you. I already know you've written these grants before, so. All right, as you write that, I'm going to go ahead and move on to the next part of this. And I'll look at your chat as it comes in. So the RFP process, we used to be very, very confident in knowing the timeline and the process for how these grant competitions will be rolled out. However, last year, if you read anything, paid attention, were involved somehow in SSS, you found that this process broke down last year for the first time. And what I mean by that is there was no draft of the request for proposals. We call them RFPs in TRIO. Some people call them NIAs. Some organizations call them FOAs. So, but in TRIO, we call them requests for proposals. COE and the TRIO community through Congress advocated for the Department of Ed to get these grants out earlier, because a lot of times the grants will be due in January or February, and the grants will be expiring in Upper Bounds case in June, but in most program cases in August or September. And many times people were not being notified of being awarded or not until as late as August, even September one year for EOC. And so there, for a long time, there's been advocacy around getting these grants out earlier. This last year, COE got a couple of members of Congress to write to the department to tell them to get them out earlier. And the result of that was they skipped all of this. They just announced the competition and said, you have, I think they gave us 75 days to write it. 75 days is actually unusual. We normally get 30 to 60 days, sometimes 45 days in that range. But with SSS, they announced it. There was no draft. There was no comment period. They just released the final RFP and gave us a due date without any warning. And that application came out, I believe it was in April, and it was due July 15th or something like that, or maybe it came out in May, but it was a 75-day period due July 15th. I say all that to say that we don't know if they're going to do that again or if they're going to follow the traditional process. The traditional process would be that they would release a draft RFP. They would give a 30-day comment period. They were required to give a 30-day comment period for the public to comment on the draft so that we as a community could suggest changes that be made to it. And then later they would take those suggestions. Most of them they didn't make too many changes for, and they just released a final RFP. And then when the final RFP came out, they would give a due date. Normally, this process would take about 120 days from the time the draft is released until the due date. So that way we had enough time to prepare. In the current climate, in the current administration, and because of what happened last year with SSS, I am not confident that this process will be followed again. It is very possible that they just release a final RFP and give us a due date at any moment that they want to. I'm not saying that to scare you. I'm just saying that to tell you that you should be prepared for it to come out at any moment. And we don't know when that's going to be. We have heard through COE and others that that there has been a delay in things. For example, the Gear Up grants were just submitted on February 3rd, so they have to read those. They still haven't completed the reading and scoring of the SSS grants that were submitted last July. They're supposed to get that slate out by June. They must get the Gear Up slate out sometime in the summer, probably July or August, because those programs will be starting in September. There are other competitions the Department of Education runs in addition to those. We don't know if there will be any Title III or V competitions yet. But I say all that to say that there's a lot of stuff going on right now. There's a new administration, a new secretary. As you've probably seen in the news, there's a lot of scrutiny being placed on lots of federal funding, especially the Department of Education. And so it is possible that this could be delayed a little bit and not be due in July, the same time as SSS was last year. but I don't want anyone to get overconfident in a delay because I want everyone to be prepared for this application to come out at any point with no warning. Are there any questions or comments, or anyone want to discuss that any further? Because I know that this is the most stressful part of the process, is just sort of not knowing. I will say that we should, we could expect the competition or the due date to be anywhere between like, yeah, yeah, exactly, Jennifer. We don't know because of just all of the uncertainty right now, but what we do know is that in the past, in 2016 and 2021, those grants were due in February, very late, which would mean, literally 11 months from now. But because they're trying to get these competitions out earlier, the RFP could come out anywhere between May and December. We're really not sure. And I know that's a large window, but that's because we just don't know. There's just too much uncertainty going on with a new administration, a new Secretary of Education, and with all of the, like I said, the scrutiny with higher ed programs right now. So the best that you can do is to prepare now. Begin preparing now. Start to, ensure that you have your target schools already on board, that you have letters of commitment from those target schools that allow you to put them in your grant, that you get your institutional commitment secured, your community commitment secured. Get everything you need from external sources, including data, anything you need from anyone else, you should be trying to get it now. So that way you'll have everything you need to actually start writing the grant. What you don't want is for it to come out and you're not prepared, and then you have to go to a bunch of people and get their commitments and get their signed letters and get their in-kind contributions and all those things secured. You really should start with those external pieces first, right? I always tell people, get what you need from other people before anything else. That way, you can burn the midnight oil, you can be up on Saturdays and Sundays and nights working on this grant. You can't expect other people to do that. And so you want to always get what you need from other people first. We can expect to have competitive preference priorities and some kind of logic model section. Whether that logic model section is in the grant selection criteria or whether it's in the competitive preference priorities, we won't know. In most recent competitions, they've been putting the logic model, or what they call demonstrates a rationale or quality of project design. They have been making those competitive preference priorities recently, so we could look for that. What are competitive preference priorities? We call them CPPs. CPPs are priorities from the Secretary of Education. So anytime there's a new administration and a new Secretary of Education gets appointed, or confirmed, I should say, they will publish a list of national priorities for education. And from those national priorities, they can then pluck from them and insert them into any of these education grant competitions and call them competitive preference priorities. So because there's a new Secretary of Education, it's highly unlikely that they will just adopt the previous secretary's priorities, that they will come up with a new list. We don't know what they are. They've not been published. The secretary is just coming on board now. So there is no guarantee there will be priorities, but I think we can assume that, the past several years of competitions, there have been competitive preference priorities in every competition. You might note in the RFP when it comes out that they often say that these competitive preference priorities are optional. However, they're not optional because they have points attached to them, meaning that you can earn points for them. And if you don't write for them, you almost assuredly will not get funded as a new applicant, because you'll as a new applicant, you'll almost need a perfect score. And so while they say they're optional, they're really not, because everybody else is going to write for them except you. And then therefore you're going to automatically not get those several points where everyone else will. Sometimes they will put in invitational priorities or absolute priorities. Invitational priorities typically do not have any points, and therefore you're not required to write for them, and there's no repercussion for not writing for them. There's no points. Absolute priorities are no points, but you do have to write for them. In TRIO, we haven't seen any invitational or absolute priorities in quite some time in a few competitions. So there may not be any of those. However, again, a new administration, they've got a lot of things that they want to accomplish. And so anything is on the table, in these competitions. I usually get the question of how can we start writing the grant now if we don't have the RFP or the due date? And the answer is because the selection criteria for TRIO grants are already outlined in federal regulations. So if you go to the federal regulations on the Department of Ed website, can you all see this Department of Ed website instead of my presentation? Just want to make sure you can see it. Okay. Excellent. So if you look at these regulations, you'll see a table of contents here. And if you scroll down, it says here, how does the secretary decide which new grants to make? 643.20. If you click on that, you'll see here, where are we? Sorry. I selected the wrong one. Here it is. I'm sorry. It's what selection criteria does the secretary use? 643.21. My mistake. So if you click on 643.21, you'll see here that in federal regulation, what selection criteria do they use? You'll see the need section is 24 points. And you'll see here, there are 6 subsections for the need section. And it also goes to objectives here. It does not list the objectives outright, but I'll show you where to find those. Plan of operation is here. Application and applicant and community support here. Quality of personnel, budget, and evaluation. So this tells us that the Department of Education must use this selection criteria to determine how to evaluate an application for a grant. So we know all of this for sure will be in there. It doesn't mean that they can't add additional selection criteria, and they have in the past, including things like competitive preference priorities. But at the very least, we know this selection criteria will be included in the grant application. So you can already start on all of this stuff. If you're an existing grantee and you're renewing your grant, this selection criteria has not changed since the previous competition in 2020, 2021. It's the same criteria. The reason for that is the Higher Education Act was not reauthorized and there have not been new regulations written. So these same regulations will apply to this competition. All right. I linked the Higher Education Act legislation to this presentation, the regulations, the general administrative regulations, which are EDGAR, and the OMB grants management circulars are here. So when you get this presentation, it'll send you links to all of those. First question, how many Talent Search grants may you actually apply for? Does anyone know? Multiple, okay. Good guess. How many multiple? Anybody have a guess of a number? You have 3 there? Okay, excellent. Really, the answer is kind of a trick question. It's unlimited. The regulations say that you can write for additional Talent Search grants as long as they serve a different target area or different target schools. So you can write multiple grants as long as you have a different set of target schools that you can write in the grant. I also encourage people, and Jennifer, in your case, you already have 3, but if you only have 1, I do recommend people applying for more than 1 if you can get another district or another set of target schools on board. If you're writing a new application, I recommend submitting 2 or 3 different applications just because you may get a panel of readers that score more difficult than other panels of readers, and so they may nickel and dime you on things here and there. And so you have a better chance of getting funded. In fact, in the past, I've had clients where we wrote 3 or 4 different grants, and we would use one grant as a template for the other ones, and they would get different scores because different readers take points off for different things. I've even had an extreme scenario where we wrote 4 grants and 3 of them got perfect scores and one of them lost 14 points. And so the one that lost 14 was identical to the other 3 and just got a really bad panel of readers. So I always recommend, if possible, to submit multiple applications if you can. Who's eligible to apply? Institutions of higher ed, secondary school, nonprofit organizations, community-based organizations, or a combination of those. You can create a partnership between these groups and submit a co-application as well. We talked a little bit about the selection criteria, when I showed you the regulations, but again, you'll have for sure the needs section, the objectives, the plan of operation, the applicant and community support, quality of personnel, budget, and evaluation. And again, quality of project design is basically the logic model, and competitive preference parties. Those 2 are going to be likely to be included, but we won't know until the RFP is out. So it's best to stick with these 7 selection criteria now until the RFP comes out and we find out what other items they might be adding to it. I'm going to go over each of these sections individually. So I'm going to give you some tips and tricks for each one of the sections and kind of give you some visuals of some, charts and graph kind of examples that you can use and things like that. All right. At any time, if you have any questions, please go ahead and unmute, ask it verbally. You can also use the chat box. The needs section. I paraphrase a little bit here, but again, you can look at the full language in these regulations. I'm going to actually copy and paste this in the chat box. That way you all can have it. So you can look there. You can also follow along with this presentation. So the first section asks for basically identifying that there are a lot of low-income families in the target area. You can do this by using census data to look at poverty metrics. You can look at free and reduced lunch rates. You really just need to outline that the target area that you've chosen has a high percentage, high number of families and students that need to be served by this program. Number 2, they want you to discuss the persistence rates of students, the fall-to-fall persistence rates. This is something that I find that many schools don't necessarily track exactly this data point. If your target schools do track their own sort of promotion or persistence or retention rate or something like that, you're in luck. If not, you're going to have to probably get raw data that shows how many students from one year complete that grade level, complete all credits, and move on to the next grade level, having completed all those classes. So, for example, many high schools and middle schools do not hold students back. Everybody basically persists to the next grade level, but some students don't persist with the same number of credits. Maybe they fail a class or multiple classes. They were in 9th grade, but they failed Algebra 1, so they got to retake Algebra 2 in 10th grade. While they might be considered in 10th grade, we could use some proxy data here to say, they're not persisting at the same rate of other students because they're not completing all their courses. So you may have to get creative with this particular data point if your school does not specifically track this. I would say 99% of the time, the people I work with on their grants typically say everybody persists, right? Like everybody moves to the next grade level. So again, you may need to use something creative here. Number 3, a low graduation rate. Oftentimes this, people try to put dropout rates here instead of graduation rates, like the inverse, but they specifically want you to talk about the percentage of the students who start in 9th grade who graduate 4 years later on time with a regular secondary school diploma. So while the high school may have a published graduation rate or a published dropout rate, quite often those are inflated because they don't include lots of students who maybe didn't graduate on time, didn't graduate with a regular diploma. Maybe they graduated from an alternative school, but they still count them. or maybe they send a lot of students to alternative schools and don't count them at all. So that way, again, their graduation rate looks a bit inflated. So again, you may need to look at some raw data or just talk to your schools and say, you know, we're trying to find a rate that's lower here that actually represents, if you had 100 freshmen start 4 years ago, of that 100, how many of them made it to their senior year, and then how many of them graduate at the end of their senior year. So you may need to, again, use some proxy data to, because your goal is to try to show the highest need possible. And so you want to try to get these, what we call baseline data numbers, we want them to be as low as possible. So you're trying to find bad data here. You're trying to find data that shows that the schools you've chosen really do need Talent Search to help their students. You probably don't want to go into this competition with a 99% graduation rate or a 98% graduation rate for your schools. If that's what it is, that's, you know, you can't fabricate data. You've got to include the real data. I'm not telling you to make up numbers or anything like that, but you are at risk of losing points because the reader will say you're not demonstrating need on this particular data point. And they can deduct points if you're not showing need for every, you know, each individual data point that you're representing. Also, you must have comparison data for this. So you've got to compare the graduation rates of your schools with the state graduation rate or the national graduation rate or some local graduation rate, maybe a local district that's more higher performing district or a higher performing school within the district. So you'll have to have some kind of comparison data for each of these data points as well, which I'm going to talk about here. The next thing is they want you to report the low college enrollment and college completion rates of your students. You probably will get the low college enrollment rate from your school, but the college completion rates, most schools do not track college completion of their students up to 6 years after high school graduation. So some people, you know, will have the schools use National Student Clearinghouse and do that. But what other people do and what I recommend is using the census data that shows the percentage of adults who are, you know, 24 years and older who have a college degree within your community, and use that as a proxy for college completion rate of your community, of your target area. Okay, so you can use census data on that. They also want you to talk about the percentage of students who do not complete a rigorous curriculum upon graduation from high school. There are 6 different definitions of rigorous curriculum in the regulations. And so you can choose any definition that you want to. And we can go into greater detail about what rigorous curriculum might be, but it could be things like AP and IB course completion with earning a 3 or better on the AP test. They give a list of courses that need to be completed. There could be a state-defined rigorous curriculum you use. But again, there's multiple definitions here. The definition you use to write your grant has to be the same definition that you use to measure the outcome of the objective post-award as well. So be careful about just deciding whatever rigorous curriculum definition you want just for the grant, because you have to note that you'll need to use that to measure one of your objectives. And then this last section is they want you to talk about low academic achievement, and they give you some examples like GPA, test scores, student to counselor ratios, and there's other stuff that you can include here. This is kind of an open-ended section where you can put lots of different academic achievement deficiencies that your schools have. So those are the 6 subsections. Some tips. You're trying to identify data that represents that the target schools have a need for talent search services. I mentioned that a little bit ago, but your goal here is to make the school is to show the highest need that the school has as possible. If you, one thing you can do is to try to represent data from students who are first gen low income or free and reduced lunch as compared to students who are not free and reduced lunch in the same schools, your target schools. I don't recommend that as your first choice, but if the data is not cooperating, meaning that your schools have relatively high data, you may need to move to comparing the data for, you know, for low income students versus non-low income school students in the school. The data that you're representing here in these subsections will be the data that you're using to create baseline numbers that will allow you to set proper objectives. You cannot write your objectives if you don't first outline the baseline data here. So that's one of your goals, and that's the way you should view this section. You should be thinking, am I creating baseline numbers for the stated objectives that we're going to include in the next section? I already mentioned using comparison data, but you also need to use recent data. The Department of Ed says that you must use data that's not more than 3 years old, but they want you to use the most recent data available to you. Now, what does that mean? If you can't get a full complete data set for the 23-24 year or the 24-25 year, if this grant's not due until next fall, then you use the most recent year of data, which would allow you to have every data point you need to write the grant. So if certain data points are not yet out, not available yet, you want to use the previous year's data. Okay. Use tables, charts, and graphs and to explain it. So here's an example. You know, this is a high level of example of all the data points. You're not going to put them all in one table, but I just did this for simplicity. You want your eligible school, eligible or target schools, or you could have your non-eligible students who would not be eligible for TRIO, or your state or national data, whatever comparison group is going to go here, and then some kind of difference between the two. So your target school data, your comparison data, and kind of the difference. And again, you want to label the baseline for each of these objectives in your needs section. So when you go back here and you do persistence rate, that's going to set the baseline for objective A here. Whoops. And so you want to label it in your table. I usually put it in red just because it stands out a little bit more. But this is just an example of how every table that you include, if it includes a baseline for one of your 5 objectives, you want to label it in your needs section to make it easier for the readers to find that data point. Okay, so this is just a very simplistic, crude table that makes it easier for a reader to see what you're looking at. Some people will send me their grants to review them, and I see all these very complex tables and bar charts and all these things, and the numbers are really small and it's hard to see them. They look nice, they look professional, but the readers, if they can't decipher, read the information, or they can't understand what you're saying with the charts and graphs and tables, it's actually counter to what you're trying to do. So I recommend the most simple data tables as possible so the readers have an easy time reading them. You don't know who the readers are. You don't know their level of ability to be able to read, you know, complex tables and charts and things like that. So keep it simple. This is not, you know, a PhD dissertation. This is, your goal is to help the reader find the points that they want, that you want them to give you for these applications. So make it very simple. I often, you know, get the question, well, where do we find all this data? The basic places I would look for are, number one, you need to be familiar with census data for these, for this particular grant. Same with EOC, less so for other grants, but specifically for Talent Search, you'll need some census data. State national reports, so you can get comparison data for it. And then your school district or your individual school sites should be instrumental in getting you data that's not publicly available or, you know, on public state or national reports. There's some data that only the school will be able to give you. For example, most states do not track student level college enrollment rates of all their students. Most of the time, you can only get college enrollment data from each of the schools or from the district. And even then, it can be somewhat spotty. Are there any questions about the needs section before I move on to the objectives? The needs section is by far the most important part of the entire grant. So if there are any questions, now would be a good time to ask about the needs section. If you can't nail the need and you don't have proper data points and you don't have comparison data, and your target schools are not underperforming whatever comparison data you've chosen, you're very likely to lose points for that reason. So you can't just select any comparison group you want. Your comparison group has to be performing better than your target schools. Forgot to mention that part. All right. And I've seen some readers, let's say 4 of these data points show your target schools underperforming the state or national or local data that you've used as a comparison, but one of them is not. I've seen some readers deduct a point for that one data point where your target schools are overperforming your comparison group. So while they can look at a target school average, oftentimes they can cherry pick individual data points. And so it's really important that your target schools are underperforming your comparison group. All right. So the objective section is completely tied to that need data that we just talked about. Your objectives must be both ambitious and attainable at the same time. If they're ambitious but not attainable, let's say you say your graduation rate is going to be 100%, the reader might say, well, 100% is not attainable. Like one student is going to just not graduate at some point. So they just give you 0 for the entire objective, right? Or if you say your baseline graduation rate is 80% and you're only going to improve that to 82%, they're going to say, well, that's not very ambitious. It is attainable, but it's not ambitious enough. You just get 0. So they don't give you partial credit. So you have to improve upon your baseline, but not so much higher that they don't believe you. All right. So there's sort of some magic in how you find the middle ground between what's ambitious and what's attainable. The baseline data that we just talked about in the needs section is the only data that you need to use to set these percentages. And your baseline data is the only thing that will make your objective ambitious. Okay. So if we're talking about high school graduation rate, you're setting the baseline data up here in your needs section for graduation rate. Again, let's say it's 80%. Now you must propose an objective that's higher than 80%, which was your original baseline. That's the rate at which students are graduating without your help. With your help, they're expecting you to do better. And so your baseline data of 80% must be improved upon. How much higher can you go and still be attainable? Nobody knows the answer to that because every reader is different. But what I try to tell people is that you need to go several percentage points higher than the baseline. So if it's 80%, you want to go to 87%, 90%, 92%, something in that range, right? There's no specific thing that every single reader is going to look for, but you need it to be significantly above the baseline, but you don't want to go from 80 to like 98%, for example. That would probably not be seen as attainable. So your baseline number is how you decide what your objective is. And it's the only thing that can make it attainable. Ambitious. The only thing that can make it attainable is that you create a plan of operation with staffing, budget, support, and the services that you provide specifically designed for that objective. So whatever you do in your plan of operation, you're going to say, for graduation rate, we're going to do, a student audit of, their graduation requirements. We're going to provide tutoring, supplemental instruction, whatever you're going to do to help a student graduate is what you're going to put as in your attainable section. Okay. So, I'm going to, whoops, sorry, I skipped down. The 5 objectives are here, and I talked about them in the regulation, but I'm going to show you another document where you'll find the actual objectives. So when you get the RFP, you're going to get this document in there. This is called the program profile sheet. You'll see at the top of it here. It's the Talent Search program profile sheet. You have to fill this out for your grant application, but it includes your grant objectives. And it tells you word for word what your objectives must be. You can see here, these are the same, these are the same objectives that must be stated in part 3 project narrative section of your grant objectives. So you can see that they put capitals and bold must. And so therefore these are required objectives. They're standardized. Everybody in the country has to use these same objectives, and you should copy and paste them word for word and put them in your grant narrative. So these are the 5. Percent of non-senior participants served each year will complete the current academic year and continue in school for the next academic year at the next grade level. So this is why I said at the next grade level. While they might be promoted from 9th to 10th, if they didn't complete all their classes in 9th grade, they're not technically at the next grade level because they don't have the same amount of credits as everybody else, right? So this is what gives us that sort of leeway to create our own data points other than what the school might give us. So that's secondary school persistence. Secondary school graduation with a regular secondary school diploma. Percentage of seniors served during the project year will graduate during the project year with a regular secondary school diploma within the standard number of years, which is 4 years. Graduation with a rigorous secondary school program of study. Percentage of seniors during the year will complete a rigorous secondary school program of study and graduate during the project year with a regular secondary school diploma within the standard number of years. They might change some of this language in the next RFP. So don't just use your previous grant narrative. You want to go to this program profile sheet and copy and paste the new language and make sure you're addressing it appropriately. Don't depend on old language because they do tweak the language in every competition. They change some words here and there.
Keith.
Yep.
Question.
Sure.
Back to your the regular versus rigorous. I know that in this day and age we probably default to rigorous, but how do you, with ambiguous information out there, how do you clarify a regular versus rigorous program?
Well, the first objective is just, did they graduate or not? Doesn't matter if they graduate the rigorous curriculum or not, right? And so anybody who graduates in 4 years, you know, with a standard diploma would count. And so that's kind of on its own. And then second, the next one is you have to define in your needs section what you consider to be rigorous curriculum. And as I mentioned, if you go to what definitions apply in the regulations, this is 643.7, and you scroll down to rigorous secondary school program of study. This is where I mentioned there are multiple definitions, 6 definitions. You've got to decide which of these definitions apply to your program. And then that becomes your baseline for this objective right here, which is that what percentage of students graduated having completed, you know, what you said. And so the first one is just very general. It just, did they graduate or not? And the second one is, did they actually complete a rigorous study or not? So they're separate. Does that answer your question?
Thank you.
I think I saw another question. Okay. Thanks, Jennifer. All right. The last 2, percentage of participants who graduated will enroll in college, right? It says a lot more than that, but that's basically what it says. Please note that it said the percentage of students who graduated. So your baseline is only of those seniors who graduated, what percentage of them went to college, not every senior, because if some of the seniors didn't graduate, then of course they didn't go to college. So you have to make sure that your baseline data is of those graduated, what percent enrolled. And then finally, of those who did enroll, what percentage of them will graduate with their degree within 6 years? And it could be any college graduation counts. Associate degree, bachelor's degree, certificate, anything would count for graduation. Again, where do you get the baseline for this? I recommend census data that shows the percentage of adults in the target area that have completed a college degree as your baseline. Because again, I've not seen hardly any schools except maybe some private or charter schools that actually track the college graduation rate of their high school graduates. Most high schools That's not their responsibility to track that, and so most schools don't track it. Back to objectives here. Okay. Any questions about objectives? Pretty straightforward, but again, you must have a baseline. If you do not have a baseline for your objective is just not written correctly, and you likely will not get any points. And I will say that when I was reviewing a lot of grants that were not successful in the application process, the vast majority of them got 0 out of 8 on their objective section, simply because they did not establish or discuss their baseline at all in their writing of their objective. So they just lost every point. Your plan of operation is how you plan to run your program, what kind of services you provide, how are you going to recruit your students, what kind of timelines are going to use, what kind of partnerships have you established, what kind of administrative policies do you have, and how you're going to track your participants. So anybody can pick up this selection criteria and probably write this section. So I want to really focus on the tips here. The first is the readers take very seriously the word plan. They don't want you to make statements. They want you to discuss who is going to do it, what are you going to do, when are you going to do it, what objective does it attach to. They want to see a step-by-step plan, a timeline, a who, what, when, where, how, why questions answered, so that what people basically say is that anybody who comes in off the street, who has an education, who knows how to run education programs, could pick up your grant narrative and read it and know how to implement it. And so you can't take things for granted here. The readers don't know your program. Oftentimes I'll see someone will send me their grant to review, and I'll read, like, let's say their recruiting and selection process. And I'll say, oh, but you don't have a waiting list here, or you don't say that the director is going to sign off on your grant, or you don't do this. And I say, oh yeah, we do that. I said, but then why didn't you write it in your application narrative? Oh, we didn't even think about it. We just thought, we assumed everybody knew that was a part of it, So it's important that you don't take things for granted, that you really think through the process for how you're going to do things. And if you can't go back and read it, or someone else can't read it and see that it's an actual plan, you could easily lose points for it. You need to address your objectives. So for example, when you're writing your required services, you should tie those services back to which objective you're addressing with that particular service. And it could, one service can meet multiple objectives, right? It could be, helping students persist and graduate, right? This is where you develop your service delivery model. And make sure you include your required services. So I'm going to show you here. If you go back to the federal regulations, you'll see here, what services does a project provide? In 643.4, a talent search project must provide the following services. So you must include these 6 required services in your grant application. And then here are the may provide. So these are your, what we call permissible services. You can include any of these you want, but make sure you include all 6 of these. Otherwise, you could definitely lose points for that. It also gives you credibility with the reader that you know what your grant's supposed to look like and how to run it and what services to provide. The last tip is, I see a lot of people lose points for this reason. In their recruitment and selection process, they do not include some kind of scoring rubric for the applicants, for the students who are trying to apply to their program. And so I will see the readers say that they don't have, they have a more subjective process. And so it's important also that you kind of protect yourself by making sure that you are objective in admitting students into your program. You won't find this in the RFP. You won't find this in regulation, that you need a scoring rubric, but I've seen it happen time and time again where people lose points because they don't have it. And also because they don't create a waiting list for people, for applicants who they can add when they're open spots. So there are different reasons why people might lose points that are not explicitly outlined in the RFP. The applicant community support section it's very rare to lose points here in this section. These are pretty much gimme points as long as you follow these tips here. You want to have some kind of table that shows that that the applicant commitment, the applicant is the institution or organization that's writing the grant. What commitment are they going to provide to the grant to help it run that they don't have to spend grant funds for? So what kind of facilities, office spaces, you know, workstations, computers, desks, filing cabinets, all the things that your program would need to function that you don't have to pay for, including personnel and their time to provide time to the grant. So let's say like a financial aid counselor to do financial aid workshops, or you know, any kind of personnel who's going to give up some of their time to help out with the grant. Most people provide only in-kind contributions, but if you do choose to say that your institution is going to give you money for scholarships, or they're going to give you some of your indirect cost money back, or whatever it might be, please note that you must include in here that they're going to make that financial commitment for all 5 years of the grant. The reason for that is because they don't want you to try to say your institution is going to give you all this money to impress the readers in the first year, but they only do it once, right? Only so that you can get funded. They want you to have that financial plan for all 5 years of your grant. Again, most people don't get money from their institution, but if you do, you should say in here that you're going to get it for all 5 years. Then you need written commitments from other partners, other hired institutions. If you are a hired institution, you need to get community-based organizations and your target schools to sign on board. If you're a target school, you need hired orgs, CBOs, and other schools. And if you're a CBO, you need hired institution and schools as well. So you do not submit these letters. You can see here number 5, you don't submit them with the grant, but you're expected to keep them on file unless you're audited. Use table to reduce the amount of text and space used for this section. Again, don't take anything for granted. If something's given to you, in kind or otherwise, make sure you include it here to bolster your grant application. You do need to get some kind of signed letter. It doesn't have to be a formal letter on letterhead, signature or whatever. They just say a written commitment. You know, so even if someone sent you an email saying, yes, we commit to this, that would be considered a written commitment. It doesn't necessarily have to be a signed letter. The signed letter is what we typically do, but you know, as long as it's a written commitment, you'll be fine. I recommend people to work on this section first, along with your needs section. Remember in my opening, I was saying that you need to get things from other people first. Anything that you need to get from someone else, you should get it first, because you don't want to be waiting around for a letter or some data or some commitment or something. You want to work on this. You want to try to get your data and your commitments together first. That's my opinion. And I think it served my clients really well, simply because, again, once you corral everything into one place, now you can begin the writing process and not have to be waiting for things. Quality of personnel. You only need to include the minimum qualifications required to hire somebody in these positions. Okay, this is really important. You're not actually putting the qualifications of real people, right? So if your current director has a master's degree and 25 years of experience, you don't put that as the minimum qualifications here, because then if your director decides to leave or retire, now you've got to go out and find someone else that has a 25 years experience and a master's degree. And that's going to be very difficult for you to do. So you want to put only the minimum requirements or qualifications needed to hire any new person in this position. Okay, it doesn't matter who's currently in those positions right now. This has become really important lately because I've seen program officers really scrutinize the hiring of new directors in many different federal programs. And I've been seeing a lot of programs getting denied for hiring the candidate that they interviewed and that won in all the interviews that they've had. And now they're trying to hire this person and they don't have these qualifications they wrote in their grant application, and the department is denying their right to hire that director. It typically only applies to the director, but it is important for all staff in case you're audited. So I can't stress this enough to only put the minimum qualifications required to hire someone, okay? That includes the experience and training that they've received, as well as the degree they've the terminal degree they have, either a bachelor's, master's, or beyond, and the fields of study that they've gotten those degrees in. You should probably put 3 or more studies, fields of study. So things like education, counseling, social work, social services. You know, you could put a lot of different things in there, but you want to make sure you include the fields of study. I've seen a lot of people lose points just for simply not putting any fields of study in there. And then finally, the place I see most people lose points is in this last section called the plan to employ someone who's overcome similar obstacles as participants. Again, they take it very seriously that you have a step-by-step plan to employ this person. Not that you're going to give them a chance to interview, or not that you're just going to advertise in places, you know, where people may, you know, have come from overcome similar obstacles. They want you to actually employ this person. Having said that, with the new focus on eliminating DEI from federal awards, this may be something the department will change the language on. We'll just have to wait and see. But we're going to have to be very careful about how we word this, simply so that it does not look like a DEI hire. Otherwise, you could lose federal funds if you're being audited, or if they, you know, if the department decides they have to look at every grant application. So when the RFP comes out, it'll be interesting to see how they might change this language. But if it says the same thing, we will need to address it the way it's asked for. Otherwise, you'll lose points. So feel free to email me later on if you want, you know, when the RFP comes out, and we'll revisit that. Your budget typically has to be approved by your budget office, so we don't have to spend a lot of time on this section, but basically where people will lose points here is if they say they're going to do something in their plan of operation, but it does not show up in their budget. So for example, if you say you're going to do 3 college tours, but there are no college tour costs at all in your budget, no buses, no lunches, no nothing to pay for it, oftentimes the reviewers will, you know, they will deduct points for that reason. Now, if in your commitment letter you say your buses are going to be donated, the colleges that you're going to tour are going to give you free lunches, like if you explain where it's going to come from, you know, it doesn't necessarily have to show up in your budget at that point. But you may want to include that in your budget as a line item for non-federal funds, simply because the readers are less likely to deduct points. For example, I had a talent search client in the last competition that lost 1 point because the reader said they did not put tutoring in their budget. But the tutoring was a big part of their plan of operation. However, in their commitment section, they noted that the tutors will be provided in kind, that they're volunteers, that they don't need to pay for their tutors. And they still lost a point because it did not show up in their budget. So if there's something that looks like it should cost money, but it's going to be donated to you, you should put it in a line item in your budget as non-federal funds. Okay. Let's see. If you're going to do any competitive preference priority stuff that's going to require you to spend money, you want to put that here. And you should have an explanation for your calculations. The budget should not just be numbers. It is an actual budget narrative. So you have to describe each line item. And these are the line items that you'll be describing. And we won't know how much the budget will be until the next RFP comes out. In the previous competition, it was 277,000 max for a new applicant. And most of the time, it will be what was on your grant award notification the year that the competition comes out. So if this competition comes out this summer, it's likely that you'll be writing for what your grant award notification said in September of 2024. If the grant doesn't come out until next fall, they might make it whatever your GAN is going to be this coming September of 2025. So again, we'll have to wait and see the actual budget amount until the RFP comes out. All right. That leaves us with the evaluation. The evaluation must be appropriate for your project objectives. You must use terms like qualitative and quantitative and include what kind of data points from those two that you'll be providing. You also want to use formative and summative evaluation measures. Formative evaluation is monitoring the progress of your objectives throughout the year to see if you're on track in meeting them or not, so that if you're not meeting them, you can reverse course or change course so that you will meet them. So this sort of idea of formative evaluation is that you no longer wait till the end of the year to see if you met your objectives or not. You should know throughout the year whether you're on pace to doing so. And then summative evaluation measures is end of year, end of term, when, you know, whenever you think of summative. Your APR, of course, is a summative evaluation report. And then there will be disclosure of unintended outcomes as well. So I often tell people to use tables, and it is an evaluation plan. And so you should also include, again, who's going to do the evaluation, how often are you going to collect the data, what are the data sources you're going to use. You should have a plan for how the data is going to be collected, analyzed, distributed in reports and those kinds of things. If you don't include quantitative and qualitative measures, who's getting the data, where you're getting it from, how often, you easily can get, you know, you can easily lose points for it. All right, odds and ends. There's probably going to be a page limit of 60 to 65 pages, more than likely. A one-page single-space abstract is pretty normal. The table of contents will go at, you know, at the beginning of your project narrative, but it does not count against your page limit. They'll have the submission process outlined in the RFP. You should make sure that your institution has its SAM registration up to date. We can talk about the appeals process later, but one of the things that I'll mention here is that the formatting, whether it's single space, double spaced, text, tables, page limits, all that stuff, they're actually no longer considered requirements. They're now considered recommendations. So you don't need to worry about if a table needs to be single or double spaced or anything like that. You can't lose points for formatting. You can't lose points for spacing, punctuation, grammar, any of those things. So you should try to follow the formatting requirements as much as possible, but you don't have to spend so much time worrying that you're going to lose points if one table is off by, you know, it went into the 1 inch margin, or this table ended up being double spaced when it's supposed to be single spaced or whatever. Those things are no longer requirements. They're now recommendations. I should actually change that here on this slide. I know we started late, so we're ending a little bit late, but I wanted to open this up for questions. These are some of the frequently asked questions I get, but I want to open up to you all to see if there are any questions that you have. You can unmute yourself and do it verbally or in the chat box. Any pressing questions after this?
No question, but I just want to thank you, man. You are the consummate pro and you're still doing good things.
Thank you, Mr. Harding. I appreciate that very much. Any other questions from anyone else?
Yeah, I do. I have a question.
Sure.
And just kind of looking at big picture for us right now with our objectives, just for the 6-year cohort, objective 5, just making sure that the students are attaining post-secondary education or certification diplomas. And so right now, I feel like our current objective is pretty high. If we want to make it ambitious and attainable for this next cycle going up, I think it's going to be possibly a challenge. Is it ever okay to go back, or we just have to kind of go back and take a hit on that for our objectives?
Well, so here's the thing. Your objective, sorry, I'm trying to find the Zoom where it is. Okay, I need to stop sharing. There we go. Here's the thing. Your objectives should not be the same as they were before, because the baseline data is going to be different. So you can find a new baseline number to use for that particular objective. And what I recommend, and I mentioned a little bit in the presentation, is to use census data. And if you go into the census data, you can find the percentage of adults in the target area that have earned a college degree. And if you use that data, you can probably get a lower baseline. And with that lower baseline, you can set a lower objective. The readers do not know what your previous objectives were.
Right.
So let's say your objective right now is 75%. The reader doesn't know that. All they know is what you're telling them on paper, which is your current baseline in 2025. Right? You're going to say, based on the census data, 32% of the target area have a college degree. So our objective is going to be 42%. You see what I'm saying?
Yep.
You're establishing a new baseline, so you get to write a new objective off that new baseline. And the reader only knows what you tell them.
Right.
So it's not like, that's what a lot of people fear. They say, well, if we set a lower baseline, won't the readers count us down for that? It's like, no, the readers don't read your APR. They don't know what your previous data is, nor do they care, because their goal is to look at the future, not the past, right? They want to know, what is your established baseline now, and how are you going to improve upon that over the next 5 years? They don't care about what the previous data was.
Sounds good. Appreciate that.
Does that answer your question?
Yep.
Well, the best way to lower your baseline is, the best way to lower your objective is to find a lower baseline.
Okay.
Make sense?
Makes sense.
Okay, awesome. Feel free to email me
Thank you.
anytime. Be happy to meet with you guys.
Yep. Thanks.
All right, take care for now. Any other questions from anyone else? Rachel or anyone? Okay. Excellent. All right, you guys, I'll send this recording out as soon as I get it. Thanks for attending, and I'm here to help if you need it. Take care.